Okay, is another Q&A responding to Wei from my Facebook group entitled Mage School. And she asks, as the ego dead, so we might imagine we would continue to know pain in its various forms. That is the essence of existence. But we would not be cozened by our egos to take it personally, an attitude that converts an individual's pain into conscious suffering. Um, I would invite you to look at things a little bit differently. I think maybe a good place to start because you had mentioned in one of your other comments about Taoist sorcerers, which sounds like kind of like some occultic offshoot of like the Zheng Yi school. I'm gonna take it in like the Quan Zen direction, which is a lot more focused on like internal alchemy, Neidan. And a big part of Neidan is the transformations of Jing Qi and Shen, as you know, and via the various Danxians. And um, Jingxi and Shen are, in a sense, distinct in that they have different properties and signify different things. But many have argued that they kind of exist as part of like a spectrum of animating content, meaning that many have described Shen as essentially being like a more refined and ethereal form of qi, and Jing to almost be more of like a condensed, high density form of qi, right? So we see this spectrum from density to more ethereal, almost like spiritualized, right? Shen means spirit, and I would like to read a response to another commenter on my channel who asks, Uranus signifying evolution and Pluto signifying de-evolution, or can both work either way? And I respond, Pluto is what signifies evolution, which is why it's the primary planet used in the field of astrology called evolutionary astrology. It also deals with penetration of inwardness as it strikes to the core of anything it touches. So it's essentially the innermost stratum, because the outer planets, Saturn outward, relate to deeper and deeper aspects of the unconscious. That's the correspondence of the planets with the strata of our being, and the outermost strata is the flesh of the body, which is the earth. So we can see with descending souls endless examples of them moving away from their inward experience and to their outward experience. So this is basically necessary for God to know itself through the 10,000 things in Taoist terms, because if Pluto had its grasp on everyone, no one would progress outward into multiplicity. And God wouldn't be able to know itself because it'd be a non-dual soup with no contrast for comparison or reflection. It'd just be unmanifest Ein Sof. So Pluto releases its grasp so we can have the breath of the universe. So it allows souls to move out and out and out into externality, and it leads to worldliness. It's not a complete loss of grasp on Pluto's part, but it is a change in its expression in deference to the world and the earth as the dominant principle for the descending soul. This basically turns into mechanical evolution, which is the current of evolution which doesn't evolve or perfect consciousness, but is the evolutionary current perverted to only serve the propagation of new life on Earth. And this is how animals evolve. Because the absence of Plutonic dominance, and therefore God's direct guidance in relation to a soul, inevitably leads to worldliness so extreme that the consciousness takes on the Earth's image and becomes an animal. Uranus is more so a tool of this evolutionary process rather than the actual agent insisting on evolution. Uranus is a lot of things, but in relation to evolution, it has a lot to do with the randomness injections into reality that allows for things to change. One of my favorite videos is Third Eye Tyrone's video, You Are Being Transformed by the Flames of Entropy, where he makes the point that a pattern is something which never changes. So if it never changes, how can anything have ever been happening in the first place? So injections of randomness and novelty are necessary to create mutations so patterns can be broken and lead to outliers, which can create new patterns. But that's not to be confused with the actual evolutionary current that's progressing one in a certain direction. That Uranus, that randomness injection is more so just a tool facilitating the evolutionary process. Just like the personal daimon is specific to one lifetime and is a tool facilitating the evolutionary process. Pluto isn't the personal daimon. Really, it's the line of best fit connecting all daimons of all lifetimes such that they're leading to a particular destination. Descending souls seem to sever this connection to the heavens. It's Kronos castrating Uranus. So all they know is Earth through Saturn. Without Uranus and Pluto, there's no convergence and inwardness. Saturn as contraction for a descending soul is only a season awaiting Jupiter's expansion. This relation to divinity, which would see Saturn's contraction taken so much further that it leads to the inwardness of singularity, rather than another phase of expansion, isn't there, it seems. Uranus is a cycle breaker, a pattern ender. It shows you the way out of the cycle. Descending souls don't know anything about that. They willingly accept all cycles, but also they have polarity. So they can have high points where they get everything they want, a sun, a summer, or they can have low points where everything just kicks them around and they have a terrible time. But through it all, they're still worldly, right? Similarly, I've known people who are at the bottom of a social hierarchy and they're the person in the group everyone just picks on. And to my surprise, they still love being part of the group. They're of the Saturn of that group. But they're also of a worldly polarity and have the devolutionary current to the earth in the world. So they still love that group. So that's the end of the comment. So one thing I wanted to bring up is that there is pain and there is pleasure. This is a big misconception we have, is that we view the earth as total nonstop torment and only negative, terrible things in like a hell realm. But again, this is failing to view reality as cyclical. We're in the Kali Yuga. It's just one Yuga. It's the Saturnian Yuga. It's the worst Yuga. So of course it's going to have, it's going to be pain themed. Saturn is pain themed. There's also pleasant outcomes, and the pleasant and the unpleasant make up the addictive nature of the world, right? Which I've talked about in other videos and posts. But the interesting thing is that the pleasure and the pain, particularly the pain, is what's delivering this evolutionary pressure. Because when we are being pressed upon and in pain and pressurized, where do we move? Do we move further into the world to cope? Or do we move to a relationship with God and the divine? So that's the deal, is that Pluto spiritualizes things. A great video to watch is my video on my channel called Pluto and Emptiness, is that Pluto and Earth are opposites. Pluto is what spiritualizes things. And the Earth is what makes it carnal. Right? I talked about this in my Rain or Shine video. So really, the orientation to the world such that there's going to be pain, but if it's going to be physical or if it's going to be conscious pain is determined by the Pluto or the Earth. So I talked about in that comment that mechanical evolution is what happens to animals. It's what happens when the relationship to Pluto is severed so much that, of course, Pluto still remains a principle that is active in a person's life, but it yields to its opposite in the Earth. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So with that, evolution is turned towards the evolution that we're most familiar with, the mechanical evolution. The animals are evolving only physically and anatomically such that they are better adapted to propagate further life on Earth and to acquire worldly pleasures, right? Particularly the most carnal, high-density physical pleasures like food and sex. That's really what it's all about. But Pluto's interesting influence when it becomes dominant is that the vehicle of the pain and the pleasure is not physical and carnal anymore. It spiritualizes it. It becomes the evolution of consciousness. So you're becoming more ethereal. You're becoming less physical and dense and more ethereal. And it's kind of what I was talking about. I was talking about Jing, Qi, and Shen is kind of like a spectrum, is that you're being spiritualized. So you're having pain, and that pain is no longer like the intense suffering of the animal world, like purely physical carnal pain. Animals do not have complex psychological existential issues. They're low consciousness beings. We're high consciousness beings. And it'd be a mistake to associate that necessarily with the nervous system, because really it's more accurate to say that the physical constructs are created within the blueprint of the spiritual ones. Yeah, I'd say that's why a lot of traditional astrologers could determine corporature, in other words, how you look and appear, according to your chart. Right, so you'd find this pattern of people with this chart look this way, because the physical construct that makes up your being is shaped after the blueprint of the spiritual. And similarly, it would seem that the brain is the instrument that's responsible for the complexity and the intelligence, but really the brain is constructed around a higher, bandwidth and a higher level of the spectrum of consciousness. Some, you might say, higher frequency, such that it allows to be a receiver of more consciousness, more complex brain. So the pain continues, but it becomes more conscious. And Pluto also has the interesting property of bringing everything to a singularity. So it is kind of like there's less pleasure and less pain, because you are no longer outsourcing through attachment to the external world, and you've brought your orientation in-house, such that may not necessarily be about taking it personally or not personally, but you're no longer attached to or identifying with the things happening around you. And that kind of brings the pendulum to a close, right? It's no longer swinging back and forth between these wild swings of pleasure and pain, because before, your attachment to the external things determined your condition, psychological condition. There's a form of external attachment. And now you're no longer dependent on those external things. So you're no longer swinging wildly like that. So yeah, that was something I wanted to bring up. Naturally, we would still have to feed, she says, but we would not be omnivorous gourmands who eat for amusement, gorging down everything in nature and turning to the laboratory for more. As for reproduction, who can say? Animals are driven to copulate, and even as the ego dead, we would not be severed from biology, although we would not be unintelligently ruled by it as we are now. As a corollary of not being unintelligently ruled by biology, neither would we sulk over our extinction as we do now. And this brings up a good point as to why I'm not like a Buddhist channel. Because if I believed that the solution to all of these problems is to just kind of empty out yourself, you know what I mean, into that sunyata of Buddhism, I would just be a Buddhism channel. Like, why reinvent the wheel, Saturn's return? Why talk about all this theurgy? Why talk about all this diamond nonsense? Just practice, the Eightfold Path, and just empty yourself out and do Vipassana and do nothing meditation all day. It's simple, no need to overcomplicate it. But I think the problem is, going back to that quote from Chris Langan, if I can go to it. Okay. In the CTMU, there's something called the stratified identity, and God can be defined as the highest level of the stratified identity, the level that we all share with each other. We're all united in God, but God is good and must exclude evil in order to preserve the integrity of his identity. Something that is perfect cannot tolerate, cannot absorb, or assimilate imperfection into himself. He can tolerate it for a while, but then after a while, he's got to exclude it. I think it's an important, underrated point, is that there is this tendency to be spit back out by the one. Because there's a little bit more to it than just dissolve everything, dissolve your attachments, dissolve all boundaries and separations, dissolve your ego, and just be nothing. Just become nothing, and that way you can be absorbed into nothing. But I think the real problem with that is samskaras. Kind of like the images that are woven into the fabric of our consciousness. This is a big part of why we have the experiences externally that we do, is at the unconscious level. We still basically have all of this karma in the sense of psychological impressions that were made on the soul via our experiences. And the orientation to those things can change, but ultimately we need to clean those up and polish them. And this is why I prescribe the diamond and perfect nature. And generally the Neoplatonic perspective, that it's not, Neoplatonism doesn't just teach, stop identifying with the self and stop attaching yourself to things of the world, although that is part of it. But it equally as much teaches self-perfection. Theurgy is as equally concerned with perfecting yourself. Because that singularity, that oneness, that source is perfect. And the closer you get inward to that source, the more perfect things become. And the further out from that source you get, the more imperfect things become. That was definitely the Neoplatonist viewpoint, is the world and the flesh, the carnal things, are intrinsically more imperfect. So it's not necessarily about accepting everything as being equally the same. That does kind of end up being a consequence of the greater process. So this is why I'm all about the diamond and kind of following the evolutionary blueprint that was put there for your life from birth, is that it's not just about perfecting, or it's not just about emptying and dissolving your conscious ego, right? It's about spiritualizing everything. And Pluto offers that as a total package, right? Pluto is the enemy of the flesh. It spiritualizes things. Pluto rules Scorpio. The Earth, in my opinion, and I can make a very compelling case for it, rules Taurus. They're opposite. And the Earth in Taurus is all about physical things that you can touch. And Pluto, Scorpio, is all about the innermost core and the spirit. And so, in my opinion, Buddhism in sort of non-duality fails because you're not spiritualizing everything in all-in-one movement, if that makes sense. And in order to spiritualize everything all in one movement, the body, the samskaras, the images that are a part of your being, that are in your unconscious, that make up kind of like the film reel of what's projected outward. And, stuff like the ego and everything like that, those are all spiritualized and brought into singularity as a whole in a perfect, balanced way by just following that evolutionary path. Pluto's perfecting, but only when Pluto's dominant. So that's the big thing, is that the breadth of the universe entails that certain people are just born descending souls and other people are just born ascending souls. In other words, the reason I'm never worried about archons or demons or being mind controlled or anything is because it's basically impossible for them to maintain that control, because that plutonic pull is pulling me closer and closer and closer, and it's not a choice. I didn't make a choice for this to happen. I didn't make a choice to be a chosen one, ascending soul. I didn't make a choice to be coming closer and closer into divinity, and to be confronting more of these shadow elements, to be coming close, confronting closer into truth. But it's still happening, right? So similarly, a lot of people that go into Buddhism are descending souls. And that's a problem for a couple of reasons. One is that you're not spiritualizing the whole package, right? You're just spiritualizing, let's say, your ego and your loss of attachment. But the process of self-perfection allows you to clean out in a sustainable way all those samskars that keep you reincarnating, so to speak. So I totally understand the Buddhist perspective of like, we have these roots of attachment, and don't get me wrong, those are a very big part of it. But there's more to it than that. But also, descending souls should have never went into Buddhism, because completely outside their control, they have worldly polarity. That's the crazy thing about polarity, is it's not a choice. At least I don't think it is. I definitely don't think it is for ascending souls. Descending souls, kind of harder to say. I'm not one. But what I see with descending souls over and over again is that it's not necessarily total nonstop degradation, getting worse, getting worse, getting worse. But it really is like one step forward, two steps back, into worldliness over and over again, and into unconsciousness over and over again. And really, if anyone needs to worry about archons and demons and everything like that, that's them. Because the pull of Pluto removes you from the influence of those archon demon beings through forced confrontation. It's like literally Pluto grabs you by the neck and just drags you through all this demon. It's like ripping you out, you know what I mean, from all these, the roots of these archons and demons of deception and delusion and everything like that. It's painful, and everyone knows that being a chosen one's painful, but it's painful because you're being ripped out of this matrix. It's kind of like when Neo in the Matrix escapes the pod, right? It's just like, oh my God, coming out of this, total illusion, just can barely walk, coming into reality for the first time. So yeah, I mean, evolutionary astrology is a great thing to look into, and learning about the influence of Pluto in evolutionary astrology, because it asks the question, what is evolution? If evolution, full stop, was just the cessation of attachment and suffering, then evolutionary astrology would be pretty easy. You know what I mean? It would just be, okay, well, the chart indicates that you need to adopt the Noble Eightfold Path and meditate nonstop and cease attachment. Cool. But instead, what evolutionary astrology teaches is that in every lifetime, there is a particular aspect of your being that you need to work on and refine. And really, in my opinion, what's happening is that you first need to enter alignment with the highest archetype of your life as a form of self-perfection. And I believe the daimon kind of indicates what that might be. And then, as existing as part of that platonic form, that perfected form, right? Because what the traditional sources tell us is that we exist in the sublunary world, and that the sublunary world receives the forms, the platonic forms, which are perfect, unchanging archetypes, Plato's forms. But the nature of the flesh kind of rejects those perfect forms. And so we, as a result, we live in an imperfect and changing world. So evolutionary astrology kind of seeks to figure out what areas of your life you need to work on and to come into greater perfection of. And it works one by one. And really what I think Pluto is doing with respect to evolutionary astrology is that it is cleaning out those samskaras, right? It's cleaning out those impressions and images and psychological imprints one by one, which is why I'm really big on just, trusting the process. I believe that it's a misconception that people that quote unquote achieve nirvana cease to reincarnate. I believe basically what they're doing is it's true that they're dissolving the separations between themselves and the divine, but that just means that you, as your lower self, imperfect self, are being integrated into the perfection of the one, and the one has to spit you back on down out to Earth, right? So Earth and Pluto is kind of like a funny pendulum, because everything we know is a pendulum, right? With the zodiac, but Earth and Pluto is like its own axis. And it works a little differently. Because with Earth and Pluto axis, we see this 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing, or 2 steps back, 1 step forward. And it's almost kind of like uncontrollable. But this 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back, is working in relation to the factors of the natal chart. It's what you're born with. You're born with challenges, right? And challenges by their very nature are evolutionary. You just have to make the mature decision to allow the evolution to happen rather than clinging fruitlessly to unproductive patterns and habits. So yeah, it's like to invoke Pluto, even in my opinion, which is why I don't do it, is like, okay, I want to work on this. It's like, okay, your lower self wants to work on this. That's not what God wanted you to work on. I think God knows a little better as to what you need to work on as far as being perfected such that you can come back into enjoyment of the one. But yeah, that's an important point I like to bring up, is that the entire course of this journey called the transmigration of the souls is guided by these currents of Earth and Pluto, and ostensibly they're not a choice. And that's what allows for the breadth of the universe. And I think there is kind of a negative perception of life in that sense. It's like, what the hell, man? I didn't even choose to be here. I didn't even make a choice. And this planet just sucks. I just want to be out. I think that's what how a lot of Buddhists approach it. It's like, this place fucking sucks. I mean, Buddhist teaches that life is suffering. So how do I empty myself out such that I no longer have the roots that keep bringing me back down here? Understandable if you're only looking at life from the perspective of your worldly experience. One thing that's really good to look into is near-death experiences, because you realize, yeah, you get a lot of peace and restoration in between lifetimes. And some people have the problem of evil dilemma, philosophical problem of evil with relation to God. It's like, man, if there is a God, how can he allow such meaningless suffering and bullshit to happen? Well, if you think really deeply about it, it's like the consciousness that makes up your being has always existed infinitely. And for most of its existence, it has existed in peace and union with God. And maybe for 80 years out of that infinite experience, you have a bad time. Or however many lifetimes. It's a fractional percentage of your time as consciousness. So it's like you have so much time. Of course, time is an illusion, but let's just pretend that it's not an illusion. You have so much time in union with God, in peace and in bliss. And then you have a couple lifetimes on Earth where there's suffering. It's like I give my kid like the best friggin' life ever, but for 1 week out of her entire life, I scream at her and she has a really bad time and she cries. You're a monster. You screamed at your kid. Well, then the context of me, giving her everything else throughout the rest of her life, I think I'm really a monster. I think it's all kind of relative. So, the consciousness that makes up our being exists for a very long time, and for the most of the time, it's been in peace and in bliss with God. So the idea that we, in the scheme of that, have a tiny period of time that we exist on Earth and we have to experience suffering, I don't really see God as being some monster for allowing that to happen, and I do find it to be an evolutionary sort of process. In the scheme of infinity, it's not that bad. Okay, sorry if this video is kind of ADD. I'm kind of just riffing. Why raise another generation destined to climb aboard the evolutionary treadmill, but then why not raise another generation of the ego dead? For those who do not perceive either their pleasures or their pain as belonging to them, neither life nor death would be objectionable or not objectionable, desirable or not desirable, all right or not all right. We would be the ego dead, the selfless, dare we say, in bliss. Oh yeah, I remember my point. Yeah, I don't think it's possible because of polarity. So, like descending souls that pursue Buddhism, it's kind of like, congratulations on your one step forward, but by nature you're a descending soul, so now you're about to take 2 steps back. So you're about to go that much deeper into the world as a result of it. You're gonna swing back. It's gonna be a backswing. And if you think about it, the same thing will happen with an ascending soul, except it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That doesn't mean there's no backswing. It just means that the tendency is towards evolutionary progress in an ascending soul, in chosen ones. So the idea of let's create a generation of ego dead people, which, of course, logistically would not be sustainable. Most likely society wouldn't be sustainable in that way. But let's just say, why raise another generation? Yeah, I think you're kind of speaking to like antinatalism, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry, I haven't had breakfast. I'm kind of spacey. Yeah, I'm not having kids. Fuck that. But then why not raise another generation of the ego dead for those who do not perceive either their pleasures or pains? Yeah, the problem would just be, getting people to get on board with that. You have to kind of just want that. You can't. If you ever have a kid, you realize how hard it is to make a kid want what you want and to see what you see. Kids want to do their own shit, and kids notoriously love rebelling against their parents. And if the condition is, hey, there is a world out there full of all kinds of exciting pleasures, but you need to stay here and just renounce everything, then you're going to have a really hard time getting a kid on board with that. So yeah, the idea of biology, it's like you can kill your ego, but you're still subject to all the worldly stuff. You still got to eat. You still got to go to work. That's like a constant problem for all of us, right, in this spiritual community. Is we just want to be home and work on spiritual practice, but we got to go to fucking work. And, sex and all those biological impulses. And yes, the body is organized around those principles. We still have the artifacts of mechanical evolution making up our physical body, and it is pulling towards that. My only premise is that as Pluto's influence becomes stronger, the body starts to be reformed around the condition of the consciousness animating it, if that makes sense. In other words, because Pluto is spiritualizing and it works against the carnal and the physical, you will essentially be reincarnated in a body that does not necessarily have the conditions that it has now, today. Right? If we look at the actual structure of the body, we can see how it's composed around all of those mechanical evolution impulses of attaining food and attaining sexual reproduction to continue life on Earth. But we also see with astrology that the body follows the spirit. So if the consciousness is refined, the body will follow. So the characteristics of anatomy and biology in one lifetime, I don't think necessarily translate to all future lifetimes. I think that as Pluto's influence becomes more pronounced, we no longer have necessarily the same biological impulses. And as a matter of fact, I think the body becomes less and less, and the flesh becomes less and less. Well, I think that's all I got to say about it. If you feel like I didn't answer your question, feel free to leave a comment. And doot doot doot.